Welcome, Hazem. Would you mind just briefly introducing yourself and just tell us just briefly what you do, and then we'll dive into the questions.
Absolutely. So first of all, I could have listened to the previous panel for another 6 hours. It was fascinating, so thank you to them. My name is Hazem Nakib. We only have 15 or 20 minutes, so you can check my LinkedIn. But ultimately, I'm currently a venture capitalist, studied law at Cambridge, did a variety of things in banking and several other industries in between. Right now, it's venture capital. I do a lot of writing. We also fund quite a bit of research, a lot of advisory to governments, large corporates, and a bunch of other things. Ultimately, enjoying working with fascinating people to do interesting things that are incredibly tangible, and tangible in a sense that it's converting a lot of what's been spoken about today into practice.
So this is the second or third time we've had a conversation, and every time I finish a conversation with you, I just want to continue. So we're going to dive into some of the follow-on questions from our first ones, but let's just focus on your main activity at the moment. What is 7BC? What does it do, and who do you invest in?
So this is part of the problem when you're interviewed by a friend of yours. They know exactly what not to ask you. So ultimately, 7BC invests in digital infrastructure. If we were to envisage or imagine what the digital economy would look like in 20, 30, 40, or 50 years, there's a variety of different digital infrastructural components that are ultimately going to underpin and power that. And so we do that across, blockchain, DLT, and decentralized systems, artificial intelligence. We've done quite a bit on the explainability of AI, which ultimately goes to solve that black box issue in AI, but also kind of infrastructural components of what we think the financial sector and capital markets is going to look like, which is, I think, going to be a big part of our talk today.
So you and your team did an amazing job of going out and persuading your LPs to deploy capital with you in, actually, I mean, you're very experienced, but it is a first-time fund, and that's quite rare. So let me ask this question, which has flowed from our conversation. How do you balance the needs of an LP, right, which are about capital gain, and impact investing? I know you don't only do impact investing, but there is a balance. I mean, how do you create that balance between the two? And do your LPs understand the need for a balance?
Absolutely. I think that's an excellent question. And impact investing is slightly separate. You have a variety of different categories of types of asset classes. But ultimately, the question I think that globally, the world across pensions, asset managers, as David mentioned earlier, but also the venture capital asset class, private equity, and so on. It's looking at how do we balance capitalism and trying to make profit, demonstrate growth and returns, and so on, which is necessary for anybody to deploy capital. And on the other side, how do we do good and how do we direct it socially? And ultimately, it comes down to the methodology with which we look at things. A question was brought up earlier by David, which is, we're getting very good at measuring outcomes using new technologies. And I want to focus on this piece a little bit because I think it's crucial. Yes, we are getting better at measuring, but I don't think we're getting better at identifying exactly what we need to measure. And what I mean by that is the following. Take GDP, as a measure of growth. We've known for the last, 20 or 30 years that GDP is an absolutely horrendous measure of anything about a society, right? I'm sure everybody here knows how it's calculated. There are three major ways. The main way in the UK ultimately takes government spending, investment, household spending, and net exports. And ultimately, that is the demonstration of growth. Oftentimes, and in most countries, this part is important, it's usually fueled by consumption and private debt. That is a problem. Therefore, when one says that GDP has increased year on year by 1 to 3%, that is a horrible indicator of anything. But I think we are beginning. I don't think we're getting better at identifying what to measure, but we're beginning to start, looking, and that's because of the demands and the needs of people. For example, the idea of trust is becoming incredibly more crucial. Country after country, we've seen populations beginning to lose trust in governments. Trust is something that needs to be built continuously over time. Technology is allowing us to better kind of identify outcomes, but less so in being able to actually get under the trunk and the nitty-gritty. And oftentimes these are very social aspects, be it trust, compassion, happiness, quality of life, well-being, et cetera, et cetera. But back to your question in terms of our fund, we do our best, and that comes down to our methodology. We try to look at projects that we think are beneficially contributing to everyday life with some sort of output based on a variety of different metrics. It can be difficult, but ultimately we need to strike that balance, and we need to continue doing our best to do so. From the standpoint of innovation, it's not very, very difficult, but we need to do our best to avoid kind of rent takers, data brokers, and those types of organizations that are ultimately going to become the next wave of value exploitation of people, organizations, and country resources.
That's very honest, isn't it? We do our best. I mean, that's probably the first time I've heard such a candid response.
We try.
Do your LPs understand that?
Absolutely. I think we've been incredibly lucky across this, but also, either companies or organizations or corporates or governments we've advised that it's getting to a point where it's a necessity. If you are looking at ESG or if you are looking at sustainability more broadly, sustainability is this kind of high-level esoteric term, right? What are the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, of which, there are 150 indicators and 250 this and so on. It's not very digestible or palatable to the public. But what we do know about the SDGs is that they're very, very high-level goals that we ultimately want to strive towards and move towards across poverty, sustainable financial models and systems, et cetera, et cetera. But then what you need much more, both on the government side and deploying capital as a mandate across the financial value chain. This is crucial, right? Publicly listed companies, as an example, need to demonstrate 5% year-on-year growth, or else they die, right? They're publicly listed. Those traders, investment banks, hedge funds, and so on, they want to make money on the performance of that organization. The entire mandate and purpose with which growth and success is measured needs to turn on its head. And so where I'm going with this from an SDG standpoint is there have been a variety of academics that really try to focus on and stop the wishy-washy waffling, focus in on very, very concrete challenges and missions, being incredibly mission-oriented. We can imagine a world where the deployment of any and all capital required and necessitated an incredibly specific statement of what this is contributing in terms of value and value measurement.
A measurable statement.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So
landing on the moon is a very, very simple, readily understandable example. But things like that, very concrete percentages, but also then another component is accountability. Right. Accountability is another one that I think we've forgotten about because, if you take the financial sector and system, layers upon layers upon layers of derivatives get created, rehypothecation continues and continues and continues. And this is risky because nobody across the value chain is truly accountable for everything because it's incredibly complex and convoluted, and nobody really knows where the stick or the line ends ultimately.
So what can the government do? You mentioned the government. What can the government do to stimulate the right kind of innovation of the kind you describe?
Absolutely. So in terms of stimulating innovation, I'll unpack that to direct my answer in two primary ways. The first is, I think, the entire financial sector, and when we talk about any given sector or industry, ultimately there's a financial tinge or component to it. Everything needs to be funded in some way or form by what we consider to be money and capital, right? And capital injection and so on. The other side is actually how do we fund innovation? If we go through the last, 50 or 60 years in terms of actual tech breakthroughs, technological breakthroughs and innovation, it's all been funded by government. The private sector really comes down way later on as an aggregate of different frontier or emerging technologies that they turn into a product. But the actual development happens way early on through government funding. That's one component. The other component is the actual measurement. I think the entire financial sector needs to really overhaul how we understand success, how we understand value. That has to be led in one way or another through regulation, government involvement, government intervention. At present, governments in the world, particularly in the West and in Anglo-Saxon countries, takes an approach that's very laissez-faire, right? We only come in and we fix market risks and market failures. that's somewhat self-destructive. Whereas in several other countries, it's very, very involved. And an example of this is if you take the US. The US is incredible at that initial penetration into the market in terms of innovations in digital technologies and other technologies throughout history. Europe is incredible at that initial breakthrough of, tech breakthrough and innovation or so on the research side. Very, very bad at actual market penetration. China has been incredible at sustained market penetration. There's a few reasons for that without going into the political. But ultimately, they are very, very involved between the public and the private sector, incredibly so. So all new kind of market penetration in terms of technologies, both digital and otherwise, are built into the digital infrastructure of the country. A very, very simple example is autonomous vehicles. What they're doing in several roads and streets over there are ultimately building in sensors into the roads. Whereas in the UK, from a connectivity standpoint, we still have the copper wires that are built underneath all of the roads for connectivity purposes. That's 50 or 60 years old, for example. So it's looking at it from that standpoint that is very, very crucial. And the conclusion of that is much more co-creation between government and the private sector, similar to a lot more DARPA or EARPA models that we saw come out of the US, while overhauling our understanding of value, of growth, and of success deep within the financial sector.
So woo, I love the fact somebody gave you a round of applause for that one. So we have an interesting moment happening in the UK. It's actually a continuum of a moment, which is Brexit. Let's think about if we ever get to the end of that and we have a new government, and you are advising government, right? You've just said, sort out the copper wires, put in infrastructure. What would be the 1, 2, 3 things you would advise the UK government?
Do you see what I mean when you're interviewed by a friend of yours? But a couple of different things. For one, the UK doesn't really have an infrastructure bank. I'm a big advocate of much more involvement by government from a co-creation standpoint, but also governments taking a stake in funding those technologies, because that means in 30 years' time, when you have the next Facebook or the next Google, the government has some sort of return that isn't just predicated on either resources, exports, or tax, ultimately. So that's a terrific way. If you had an infrastructure bank, if you had a venture capital fund at every stage of the business life cycle that ultimately took a percentage of each round, where the rest of the round is completed by private market participants, that is a terrific way to generate additional income for government, but also to stimulate a lot more innovation that's actually coming on the back end in the private sector from a lot of the research that you've actually funded for a very long time. That's the first thing. The second thing, and that is quasi, venture capital funds, infrastructure bank, to ensure that infrastructure is compatible with those solutions that are coming out and being commercialized and pushed into the market. The second is very, very simple, and the EU has done their best to do this across the EU, is an observatory. Everybody needs to know what is happening, where it's happening, what the best practices are, because in Europe, we spend a lot of time reinventing the wheel. Truly, every single organization and company is ultimately doing something very, very similar in terms of support and help and value. It's very difficult to find out what's happening and where, both on the government and the private sector side. The last thing is we have a shortage on the kind of product manager side, which arguably is a shortage everywhere in the world, but in North America and in some parts of China, people truly study to become product managers, and that's a talent shortage, and ultimately that is the middle ground that we've been talking about so much throughout the day between technology and between commercial and business.
You mentioned not reinventing everything, okay, and I know that in some of your not-for-profit activities, you're together with the Cambridge Blockchain Foundation, you are creating or trying to propose the creation of the National Advisory Council. I mean, you've got a job to do, right? You've got a fund to run. I mean, this is a hugely consuming thing. Tell us about the National Advisory Council. What is its goal?
Absolutely. Very, very briefly, it's to propose frameworks for the use and the reuse of emerging and frontier digital technologies that supports everything that I've mentioned to date. I think we're at an incredibly crucial period for the UK, but also in the rest of the world, given the kind of financial state of the world, sovereign debt, private debt, and so on, that we need to better understand how we, leverage data, how we remain connected across trade, but also how we account internally towards value creation to the population and the populace. And ultimately, the National Advisory Council brings together a variety of experts from government, from the private sector, identifies the best way to collaborate, and to a point I mentioned earlier, to a point I haven't mentioned earlier around what are the things you would do. Another one is a kind of base layer technological sandbox that connects all existing sandboxes within the UK. We don't currently have that. Every sandbox operates completely autonomously and regulates technology applications, but doesn't really look at the depths of that technology across problems that cut across different sectors. The National Advisory Council touches on all of these points to provide better, more data-driven, more efficient decision-making, and touches on innovation, trade, economic growth, et cetera, et cetera. And we're moving forward. There's going to be a lot about it, hopefully in the March, April timeframe of next year. And we have incredible people like you and many others that help us accomplish and achieve that.
He means he tolerates my digging him in the ribs saying, what are you doing about this? What are you doing about that? In a post-Brexit world, how do we make Britain great again?
We can do our best to truly focus on a lot of the things that I've said during this conversation. That's not me, this is based on a variety of academics and advocates from Herman Hauser, who I've been lucky enough to work with for some time.
He told me to find you and meet you and speak to you.
Who's the founder of ARM, to people like Jeremy Soames, Mariana Mazzucato, Tommaso Aste, a variety of truly incredible academics who have worked with governments around the world. And ultimately, in a post-Brexit world, that's the opportunity to really focus on innovation, focus on well-being and reimagining how we value things, how we measure success, and how we deliver value using technology, ultimately.
And I'd also add, if I may, forging the strongest possible links with our Commonwealth partners who, frankly, we've not really done as well as we should have done. And I think that's an amazing community who we should engage with. We are going to wrap up for now, but we will be back and ask you many more questions, especially how the National Advisory Council is getting on. Please put your hands together and thank Hazem for a terrific panel.